I have to be a little bit careful here as a recent retiree from the government, FDA. I'm not allowed to ask the government to take any particular course of action, whether it's Congress or the IRS or anyone. So I'm not making suggestions. I'm just talking, rendering some opinions, and explaining some problems. So I'll highlight the problems, but I won't have any solutions for today. Thanks. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you a little background on accelerated approval. I suspect many of you know this, but there are probably some listening who don't understand what accelerated approval really is, what it was meant for. As Frank said, it was a stroke of genius. I would say it was an important and a much needed invention. And I'll lay it out like this. Imagine that there's a liver disease that's uniformly fatal without a transplant. And the disease causes few symptoms or limitations until late in the disease. So there aren't a lot of symptoms that one can measure. And the disease is common. So thousands of US patients require a liver transplant every year in order to prevent death. And so a reasonable clinical trial would assess time to liver transplant or death, because that's the endpoint that we would actually care about. But now imagine that the same disease exists, but it's rare. Or the disease is fairly common, but it's slowly progressive. So the transplants and deaths don't occur very often, okay? So a trial to assess time to liver transplant or death might take 15 years to complete, because you just don't see a lot of deaths and you don't have a lot of liver transplants. And in that scenario, it's not feasible to run a trial with clinical endpoints, because the endpoints don't occur very often, either because there are few patients or because the disease progression is slow, or perhaps both. And so now you see the purpose of the accelerated approval pathway. So the approval is based not on how many people need a liver transplant or die, but it's based on some surrogate endpoint. In this case, it would be some type of biomarker, and that would be the way to get a drug approved without waiting the 15 years that it would take to complete the trial. Next slide, please. So there are certain criteria that are required for accelerated approval. First, it has to be a serious condition. The condition can be rare, but rarity is not a requirement. It doesn't have to be rare. We saw an accelerated approval for Alzheimer's disease recently. That's not a rare disease. The drug has to provide a meaningful advantage over available therapy. And the drug has to demonstrate an effect on an endpoint that is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. Reasonably likely are the critical words in that statement. And then post-marketing confirmatory trials have been required to verify and describe the anticipated benefit. And the trial must be completed with due diligence. I've used the word clinical benefit here, and I'll also use the phrase clinical endpoint. And anything that's clinical means, in terms of the way FDA looks at it, that it measures how patients feel, function, or survive. It's a direct measure that has an impact on the patient, not a laboratory test. Next slide. So there are two types of accelerated approval. I call them two flavors. The first flavor is the surrogate endpoint. So the surrogate endpoint is not a clinical benefit, but it's deemed reasonably likely to predict a clinical benefit. And that would often be a laboratory marker, some biomarker, possibly. And the second flavor, which is used much less frequently, is an intermediate clinical endpoint. So it's a clinical endpoint, but it's measured at an earlier time point. So when it's deemed important to assess the effects of a drug on irreversible morbidity or mortality, a clinical endpoint that can be measured earlier than irreversible morbidity, mortality, that is reasonably likely to predict an effect on later morbidity, mortality, or other clinical benefit can be used. And I'm not going to say much more about that, because it really has limited applicability for rare diseases. Next slide. We're going to talk about the first flavor. Now, accelerated approval can be withdrawn by the agency. The FDA can withdraw the approval of a drug or an indication for a drug. approved under the accelerated approval pathway if, for example, a trial required to verify the predicted clinical benefit fails to verify such benefit. If other evidence demonstrates that the product is not shown to be safe or effective under the conditions of use, the applicant fails to conduct the required post-approval trial of the drug with due diligence. And those are reasons why the agency can withdraw an accelerated approval. But withdrawal of drugs and indications, it's been exceedingly rare outside of oncology. And so when you talk about accelerated approval, you actually kind of have to divide the world into oncology and non-oncology. Oncology uses the accelerated approval pathway quite frequently, and it's well honed. But outside of oncology, it's not used as frequently. And there have been some issues. Next slide. What's the standard of evidence for accelerated approval? Well, drugs granted accelerated approval must meet the same statutory standard for effectiveness as those granted traditional approval. Substantial evidence based on adequate and well-controlled clinical investigations. So the legal requirements are the same, and yet there's widespread misperception that the standards for accelerated approval are lower, that the bar is lower. And I saw some comments in the chat earlier about how this was accelerated approval was some lower standard or some secondary approval pathway. And that's not the case. In both types of approval, traditional approval and accelerated approval, you must have substantial evidence based on adequate and well-controlled clinical investigations. Next slide. The question comes up, why do people have this perception? Well, even if every accelerated approval was free of controversy, there are problems. And I tried to summarize the main ones in this slide. First of all, FDA has a lot of difficulty withdrawing drugs and indications when clinical benefit is not verified in the confirmatory study, or when a company hasn't conducted the confirmatory study with due diligence. And you might say, why is that? Well, first of all, when a study is done and the study is negative, a negative study doesn't prove that the drug is not effective. It's very difficult to prove a negative. And one can always question the adequacy of the study. Oh, well, the study was negative, but they enrolled the wrong patients, or they should never have enrolled patients who had this, or the endpoint was wrong, or the assumptions were wrong. Something was wrong. But that doesn't prove that the drug is not effective just because you have a negative study. Second of all, there are always patients who believe the drug's beneficial, and they will fight against removal of the drug. They will camp out at the FDA and explain why the drug should not be withdrawn from the market because the drug is keeping them alive. So there's that. Third, a hearing is required, a public hearing, and that's an investment of considerable FDA resources. So for all of these reasons, we haven't seen withdrawal of drugs that were approved via accelerated approval. Next slide. Well, here's where I'd like to spend a little time. And Frank alluded to this. So, what does reasonably likely mean? Reasonably likely is a critical phrase. It's inevitably a matter of judgment. I will say that. It's a matter of judgment. But, it's not that difficult to get a sense of what one means when one says reasonably likely. First of all, it doesn't mean definitely. It doesn't mean that it's plausible or possible. It means reasonably likely. So I spent a lot of time thinking about this when I was at the FDA. I mean, what does reasonably likely actually mean? I mean, what does it mean when rain is reasonably likely? And if you're living in DC, rain is reasonably likely today. I closed my window. It may be already raining, in which case it's definite. But at any rate, it's supposedly reasonably likely. So what does that mean? Is it a 50% chance of rain or 60 or 70, 80, 95? What does that mean? And, there are a lot of ways to interpret reasonably likely, but it can be translated into some, mathematical probability. I'm going to say, just for the sake of this talk, that when we say reasonably likely, we're saying a 70% likelihood. That's kind of what it means to me. And I've espoused this principle to others, and they kind of shake their heads when I say 70%. They say, yeah, that sounds good. Next slide. So we'll use that for this discussion. So if it means 70%, that would mean that the FDA is willing to be wrong initially about the efficacy of drugs approved under accelerated approval 30% of the time. So we basically say, it's reasonably likely that the your surrogate endpoint, your findings on the surrogate endpoint, prove that the drug had clinical benefit. But we could be incorrect. And if reasonably likely means 70%, it means there's a 30% chance that the drug is not effective. Okay, so that means that 30% of the drugs given accelerated approval, for them, the clinical benefit will not be verified. And it follows that we should expect that ultimately 30% of these drugs will be withdrawn, right? Because reasonably likely means there was a 70% chance a drug would cause a clinical benefit. Now, if reasonably likely meant 90%, okay, and only 10% of drugs were withdrawn, then I would say the standard for accelerated approval would be too high. We don't want 90% certainty that a drug is going to impart clinical benefit, because we want a lower threshold. We want to be able to approve more drugs. We want to take more chance, take more risk of being wrong, okay? Because patients, with diseases, that have drugs that are approved for accelerated approval, they want to be, they want to take more chance of being wrong. They're willing to accept the possibility of being wrong more than 10% of the time. So it might behoove us to make it easier for FDA to remove these drugs when clinical benefit is not confirmed. I guess the point is that, we don't see 30% of drugs given accelerated approval. We don't see 30% of drugs being withdrawn. We don't even see 10% of them being withdrawn, probably. Frank would actually have the numbers. But I doubt that it's 10%. So the point is that very few of these drugs are withdrawn. And so either there's something wrong with our ability to withdraw the drugs, or the standard is too stringent. We're trying to be too certain before we approve the drugs. One or the other, or some combination of both. Next slide. Another problem is, companies don't necessarily pursue those post-marketing confirmatory studies with due diligence. The fact of the matter is that once a company gains accelerated approval of their drug, they have little incentive to conduct confirmatory trials. I know of one company that said on their website they were making $300 million a year off of the drug that got approved under accelerated approval. Why should they be in a hurry to do the confirmatory study? What do they have to gain? Not much. So they might drag their feet. And they also recognize that, based on history, FDA is not very likely to remove these drugs from the market. So there are problems, and I have some ideas in my mind, but I'm not allowed to say what they are because of my recent retirement. So I'll only say that there are a lot of people who are interested in making potential changes to accelerated approval. Again, I think accelerated approval was a great invention, but it could be improved. And I won't say more except to stay tuned in this space. And again, I thank you very much for inviting me, and I thank you for your attention.